Greetings and welcome to week 13 in our convene class in the book of Genesis. The passage we're working on this week is Genesis 28 through verse 33. We're starting to make rapid progress through the narrative sections, and these chapters are in many ways the heart of the Jacob story. Note, first of all, at the beginning of chapter 28, the concern of Isaac and Rebekah over the marriage of Esau and of Jacob to Canaanite women, and their distress that Esau has married the local Canaanite women, and their desire that Jacob not. Do recognize that after the events of chapter 27, the stealing of the blessing and the giving of, or the selling of the birthright, that Esau does to Jacob. Jacob is now if we can put it this way, the chosen one who's going to be the heir to the promise made, first of all, to Abraham and then repeated to Isaac. And so, in some sense, this concern over marriage to the locals is not an issue of racial or ethnic arrogant egotism. There may be some of that, but the central issue is the issue of religious purity or theological purity. And the emphasis that it gains here in chapter 28, I think, is reflective probably more of the copy tradition and the history of Israel throughout the Old Testament as this story is passed along, that this particular detail, this issue of intermarriage with the Canaanites, becomes a much greater issue than it really was in Isaac and Rebekah's life, because of its importance in the conquest period and then in the period of the monarchy, where the intermarriage with the Canaanites becomes the means by which Israel succumbs eventually to Baal worship. And so that issue of theological and religious purity is an essential and important issue at stake here. Note also then the encounter of Jacob with God at Bethel, the vision that he sees. And then not only the conversation that happens through the vision, but then what Jacob says in the morning when he wakes up. And the issue is more than just sleeping with a hard rock as his pillow. The issue is, among other things, the renewal of the promise now to Jacob, God affirming that he is to be the descendant according to promise that was made back to Abraham in Genesis 12 and following, as well as in the morning after, the negotiating that Jacob engages in. Okay, God, if you'll do thus and thus and so and thus and so and thus, so then I will serve you and I will let you be my God, so to speak. It is not a stellar moment in Jacob's life in terms of where God wants him to be. Note also in chapter 29, Jacob's arrival in Haran and meeting Rachel at the well for the watering of the sheep. And note the similarity from the Rachel story here, watering sheep, with the Rebekah story back in Genesis 24. And also give some attention to just the kind of the cultural details of how Bedouin life, shepherd life, operated in those days. You certainly get a great picture of that. Also do note the process moving toward the marriage of Jacob to, he hoped it was going to be Rachel, and then it was Leah and Rachel. A sad reminder that women were considered commodities in that culture, and the woman was a productive worker in her father's house, and for her to leave father's house and go to husband's house, a tent in this case, but to leave the protection and the economy of the father to the protection and the economy of the husband would be financial loss for the father that had to be compensated for by a bride price. And thus, Jacob, having no money, works it out in terms of almost slave labor, or labor, in exchange for money to pay the bride price. Do reflect a little bit about customs, see if you can learn anything about marriage customs, and the strange reality that Jacob wakes up the morning after and discovers that he's married Leah, not Rachel. Then the whole rest of the sort of encounter of Jacob developing a family, the conflict between the wives, the giving of their handmaidens to their husbands to bear children for them. All of those things we've seen before with Sarah and Hagar, and it's part of the culture that existed in that part of the world in a fairly narrow slice of history that we have recognized from somewhere around 1700 BC to around 1500, 1400 BC. Maybe 100 years earlier on the limits there. Okay. And then notice the return of Jacob heading back because of the promises of God. He needs to get back to Canaan. That's the land of promise. And so he makes the steps necessary to make the return. Do be aware that the big issue over the household gods, the idols, in that culture, whoever had the household gods inherited all the property of the father. So essentially, Rachel had stolen the copy of the will, the only copy of the will, but the heir was blank, and she wrote her name in there by having the household gods. And that's why that was such a big deal. Finally, be aware, again, I think we talked about this on our last day and convened in our face-to-face session, the significance of the stranger wrestling with Jacob through the night, and the transformation of character that goes with the name change. Those of you who are Nazarenes should be aware that 60 to 100 years ago in our denomination, lots and lots and lots of preachers took the Bethel experience of Jacob with God as a typological experience of a conversion, and the wrestling with Jacob with the stranger at night as a typological experience of entire sanctification. You don't find lots of, at least preachers who've been through an educated process like we're going through, that will do that today, but it wasn't totally wrong about the fact that there's transformation of character that takes place. And you pick that up in Borgman to some degree too. I hope you have a great week as you study these sections and as you work on your paper and begin to be drawing the work of this semester to a close. Have a great week. Thank you.